Guten Tag! Today I want to show you how to convert your sourdough starter from a vinegary starter, which is relatively strong in terms of taste, to a more mild, yoghurty sourdough starter. And you will be surprised how easy that actually is. Let me show you. For this to get to work, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a bit of my regular sourdough starter, which is at around 100% hydration, and into a clean jar I'm just putting a little bit of this, around 15 grams. Now I'm going to give this another feed. I'm using whole wheat flour. In my experience, that works very well. Around double of that. So 30 grams roughly. You can use whatever flour you use to typically feed your sourdough starter, so don't worry too much about that. And now I'm going to give this a lot of water. That was 150 grams, around 5 times of the flour's weight. Don't create such a mess like I'm doing, and just keep stirring this nicely. And that's it. That's about all I have to do. Now I'm going to cover this one and my other starter as well. Now it's waiting time. For this to work, I had to repeat this around 3 or 4 times. After a week, I would notice that the scent of this one is just so much different from the regular starter that I had. So why does this work? In your sourdough starter, you both have yeast and bacteria. The yeast is producing ethanol, which is alcohol, and CO2. The CO2 bubbles are inflating our dough. That's what gives us the majority of the oven spring. Now for the lactic acid bacteria, it's a little bit more complicated. You have homofermentative and heterofermentative lactic acid bacteria. Homofermentative because they're just producing one thing, and that's lactic acid. Heterofermentative because they can produce multiple products. They're producing lactic acid, CO2, and even a little bit of alcohol. Now looking at that group of bacteria, mostly the heterofermentative, you have aerobic and anaerobic lactic acid bacteria. Aerobic because they need oxygen, anaerobic because they don't need oxygen. And this is the trick. By having this layer of water, which you can see right here, we are forcing the lactic acid bacteria to go into an anaerobic mode. We are also prioritizing those who live in an anaerobic environment. The majority acids which the lactic acid bacteria produce is lactic acid and acetic acid. Lactic acid is the yoghurty acid. Acetic acid is the vinegary one, the one which has a very, very strong taste to it. Now the path to produce acetic acid always requires oxygen. And of course, there's still a little bit of oxygen inside. But since we don't move the water, the dough is somewhat shielded from the top. This means that your lactic acid bacteria are no longer able to produce as much acetic acid. They are producing more lactic acid. So the taste of your sourdough is actually going to be different. That's awesome, isn't it? A little bit more background. I was developing a drink made out of sourdough. And there's going to be a full video on this soon. It's currently finishing its last stage of fermentation. But it really tastes like liquid yogurt. And I think that's really cool that you can make a drink out of sourdough. And it actually tastes pretty awesome. So we now have just turned our sourdough from a CO2, ethanol, lactic and acetic acid factory to mostly a CO2, ethanol and lactic acid factory. One thing though that I noticed is that it's very hard for me to get back the acetic note once I converted my sourdough starter into that pure lactic acid mode. Now I think that's the case because by changing the conditions and with every subsequent feeding, you're of course mostly selecting those bacterial strains which focus on lactic acid production. So over time there's evolution happening in your sourdough. And once you change the sourdough back from this liquid starter back to the more stiff starter, then you'll always have a bigger population of bacteria which produce lactic acid mostly to begin with. And they will take over your sourdough, making it very hard for the other bacteria to thrive. So my tip is keep a little bit of your mixed acetic starter, ideally dry that or store that in your freezer or somewhere in your fridge, and then conduct this experiment. Because for some breads, you might want to have a more acetic starter. This has been a really fun experience. Now every sourdough is unique. That means what works for me might not work for you. And some people actually have reported that they have a more yogurty sourdough starter to begin with. You can't say that one is better than the other, because both of them have a use. For dark rye bread, I would totally prefer the more acetic starter. For a nice fluffy wheat bread, I would prefer the lactic acid starter, the one which is a lot more mild. Super fluffy. This is perfect. And I think what I've shown you today is pretty cool, but it just barely scratches the surface. There is so much more to be discovered about sourdough. And that's why I think this hobby is so awesome. You think you just learned something, but then there are 100 more open questions. One additional thing that I wanted to say about this yoghurty sourdough starter, which is a little bit more liquid. The disadvantage of this method is really that it makes it so much harder to get the right quantity of water for your flour. Because it's so highly hydrated, you might easily end up adding too much water to your dough. So that's something that you really want to be careful with. But then again, I also tried resetting my liquidy starter to my typical 100% hydration, which is equal parts of flour and water. And even after a week of feeding, it didn't smell acidic anymore. So that might be a cool way to get the best out of both worlds. Me, I'm going to be sticking to this option for now for my regular bread. I just find it so easy to stir everything together and then you have your sourdough starter. Now I would be super curious to hear your thoughts on this. How does your sourdough starter taste? Do you prefer the acidic sourdough starter or the yoghurty sourdough starter? If you have some other cool ideas for experiments, please also share them in the comments section. As always, thank you very much for watching and may the gluten be with you.